The Duke of Wellington's regiment was a line infantry regiment of the British Army, forming part of the King's Division. In 1702 Colonel George Hastings, 8th Earl of Huntingdon, was authorised to raise a new regiment, which he did in and around the city of Gloucester. As was the custom in those days, the regiment was named Huntingdon's Regiment after its colonel. As Colonel succeeded Colonel, the name changed, but in 1751 regiments were given numbers, and the regiment was from the time officially known as the 33rd Regiment of Foot. In 1782 the regiment's title was changed to the 33rd Regiment, thus formalising an association with the West Riding of Yorkshire, which, even then, had been long established. The first Duke of Wellington died in 1852, and in the following year Queen Victoria, in recognition of the regiment's long ties to him, ordered that the regiment's title be changed to the 33rd Regiment. In 1881, following the Cardwell reforms, the 33rd was linked with the 76th Regiment of Foot, who shared the depot in Halifax. The 76th had first been raised in 1745 by Simon Harcourt and disbanded in 1746, re-raised in 1756, disbanded again in 1763, before being raised again in 1777, disbanded in 1784 and finally re-raised in 1787 for service in India by the Honourable East India Company. The two regiments became, respectively, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Duke of Wellington's regiment. In 1948 the 1st and 2nd Battalions were amalgamated into a single battalion, the 1st Battalion. On the 6th of June 2006 the Dukes were amalgamated with the Prince of Wales's own Regiment of Yorkshire, and the Green Howards to form the 3rd Battalion, Yorkshire Regiment. Following further mergers, in 2012 the battalion was redesignated as the new 1st Battalion of the regiment. Battalions from the regiment had served in most land conflicts involving British forces since its formation, for the wars of the Austrian and Spanish successions, through the American War of Independence and various campaigns in India and Africa, the Napoleonic Wars, the Second Boer War, and many of the greatest battles of the First World War and the Third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919. During the Second World War, the regiment fought as part of the British Expeditionary Force in France, forming part of the rearguard at Dunkirk, in North Africa, Italy and in France, following the D-Day landings, and as Chindits in Burma. In Korea, the Duke's desperate defensive the Hook position halted the last major Chinese attempt to break the United Nations line before the truce, in July 1953, brought the war to an end. In Cyprus the battalion was successful in Operation Golden Rain, destroying a major EOKA terrorist group operating in the Troodos Mountains in 1956. In 1964 the battalion joined the NATO deterrents in Germany on the front line in the Cold War, and from 1971 was regularly engaged in the troubles in Ulster until 1997. They were amongst the first units to cross the border from Kuwait in the 2003 Iraq War. 9 soldiers from the regiment have been awarded the Victoria Cross, and Corporal Wayne Mills of the 1st Battalion became the first recipient of the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross in 1994, whilst serving with the United Nations forces in Bosnia. Formation and name. The Duke of Wellington's regiment was originally formed in 1702 as Huntingdon's Regiment. As regiments at the time took the name of the colonel taking it over, it became Henry Lee's Regiment, then Robert Duncanson's Regiment and George Wade's Regiment. It was disbanded on the 25th of March 1714, but was officially registered as the 33rd Regiment of Foot in January 1715 and re-raised on 25 March 1715, as George Wade's regiment, then Henry Hawley's regiment, Robert Dalzell's regiment and John Johnson regiment. In 1782 Lord Cornwallis, the then colonel of the regiment, wrote that the 33rd Regiment of Infantry has always recruited in the West Riding of Yorkshire and has a very good interest in the general goodwill of the people in that part of the country. I should therefore wish not only to be permitted to recruit in that county, but that my regiment may bear the name of the 33rd West Yorkshire Regiment. On the 31st of August 1782 Lord Cornwallis heard that the King had approved of the new title, 33rd Regiment of Foot, owing to its links with the Duke of Wellington. The title, the Duke of Wellington's Regiment, was granted to the 33rd Regiment on the 18th of June 1853, on the anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo in the year following Wellington's death. The 76th Regiment was originally raised by Simon Harcourt as Lord Harcourt's Regiment on the 17th of November 1745 and disbanded in June 1746. Following the loss of Minorca to the French, it was re-raised in November 1756 as the 61st Regiment, but renumbered to 76th by general order in 1758, and again disbanded in 1763. A second battalion raised by that regiment in October 1758 for service in Africa was renumbered as the 86th Regiment and also disbanded in 1763. On the 25th of December 1777, the 76th was again re-raised as the 76th Regiment of Foot, by Colonel John MacDonnell of Lochgarry, in the west of Scotland and Western Isles, as a Scottish Light Infantry Regiment. It was disbanded at Stirling Castle in March 1784. The regiment was again raised for service in India by the Honourable East India Company in 1787. In 1881 the 76th Regiment, which shared the same depot in Halifax as the 33rd, was linked to the 33rd, under the Cardwell reforms, to become the 2nd Battalion. Although retitled as the Halifax Regiment, this title only lasted 6 months until it was changed on the 30th of June 1881, in a revised appendix to General Order 41, to the Duke of Wellington's, or W-RID-I for short. In January 1921 it was again retitled to the Duke of Wellington's Regiment, or DA for short, 1702 to 1881. Within months of its original raising, the regiment was dispatched to join Marlborough's army in Holland. After 5 months and only 2 battles it was sent to Portugal, along with 5 other of Marlborough's best regiments, where it remained for the next 6 years. The 33rd fought in many battles, including Valencia de Alcantara, Zaragoza, and less favourably at Almansa and Bruaga. It was only one of the 2 foot regiments not to be disbanded, and in 1743 the regiment was sent to Germany, where it distinguished itself in the Battle of Dettingen, gaining its first battle honour, then again at the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745 and again in Rocouen-Lauffeld in 1747. American Revolution. The 33rd itself had a good reputation for its professionalism and capability, which was seemingly unequaled by any other regiment of the British Army for some time. It was because of the professionalism in the field during the American War of Independence that the regiment was given the nickname the Pattern. The regiment then became the standard of soldiering which all other regiments should attain. The 33rd saw much action during the American War of Independence, with its first engagement at the Battle of Sullivan's Island in early 1776, when British forces attempted an assault on that city's defences. In August of that year, the 33rd were involved in the Battle of Long Island. After heavy fighting which lasted several days, the Americans evacuated the remaining forces to Manhattan. The British were victorious. The regiment's next action came a month later in September at the Battle of Harlem Heights. It was a small skirmish. Besides some Hessian troops, the only other British regiment was the 42nd Regiment of Foot. The British force, initially without the 33rd, encountered Knowlton's ranges of scouting force sent by George Washington. A small skirmish ensued with the Americans subsequently retreating. Washington then sent another force to lure the British further up the northern plateau, which he held, along with a second force to move around the flank of the British. The British took the bait and advanced further up the plateau. The American flanking force was encountered by the British, which showed them the imminent danger they faced. After some further fighting, the British retreated to a field, where they were joined by the 33rd and a number of Hessian battalions. After further fighting, the Americans retreated. The regiment was also involved in the Battle of Fort Washington. After that, the 33rd were not involved in a major battle until September 1777, when they took part in the Battle of Brandywine, where the British suffered 550 casualties and the Americans about 1,000. The regiment took part in further action that year, at the Battle of Germantown and the Battle of White Marsh, where they fought the Americans who had retreated from the fighting at Germantown. The following year was just as active, with the 33rd seeing action at the Battle of Monmouth, an engagement that became the largest one-day battle of the war. The 33rd was also part of the defense of Newport and Quaker Hill. 2 years later, in 1780, the 33rd took part in the Siege of Charleston. By the 11th of May, the American General Benjamin Lincoln began to negotiate terms of surrender. The following day Lincoln, along with over 7,000 American soldiers, surrendered to the British forces under the command of Lieutenant General Henry Clinton. In August that year, the 33rd were involved at the Battle of Camden, a victory for the British. Guilford Courthouse. The year 1781 proved to be the deadliest but most successful year from the 33rd. The regiment took part in the Battle of Wetzel's Mill, but the more famous action took place that same month during a battle at Guilford Courthouse. On the 14th of March 1781, Lord Cornwallis, the British commander, was informed that General Richard Butler was marching to attack his army. With Butler was a body of North Carolina militia, plus reinforcements from Virginia, consisting of 3,000 Virginia militia, a Virginia State Regiment, a corps of Virginian 18-month men, and recruits for the Maryland line. They had joined the command of Major General Nathaniel Greene, creating a force of some 9,000 to 10,000 men in total. During the night, further reports confirmed the American force was at Guilford Courthouse, some 12 miles away. Cornwallis decided to give battle, though he had only 1,900 men at his disposal. At dawn on the 15th of March 1781, before the men had a chance to have breakfast, Cornwallis started for Guilford, arriving there at midday. Cornwallis's troops included Boss's Hessian Regiment and the 71st, commanded by Major General Alexander Leslie, and the 23rd and 33rd, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Webster of the 33rd. The second line comprised the 2 battalions of Foot Guards, the light infantry and the grenadiers, commanded by Brigadier Charles O'Hara of the 2nd Coldstream Regiment of Foot Guards. There was then a reserve consisting of Tarleton's light dragoons. The British troops advanced under heavy musket fire. Webster attacked the right flank of the American second line and managed to push it back. He also attacked the American third line. An American counterattack then led to a confused situation. Meanwhile, Tarleton's light dragoons charged the right flank. The American troops then withdrew. The British technically defeated the American force, but Webster was killed and O'Hara was wounded. Green Spring. The 33rd also fought at the Battle of Green Spring in July of that year. The last engagement of the war was at the Siege of Yorktown, when they were part of the outnumbered British forces. Flanders. In 1793, Arthur Wellesley, the third son of the Earl of Mornington and future Duke of Wellington, purchased a commission in the 33rd as a major. A few months later, in September, his brother lent him more money, and with it he purchased a lieutenant colonelcy in the 33rd. The regiment took part in the disastrous Flanders campaign and the retreat from Germany, and embarked from Bremen for England on the 13th of April 1795. Wellesley was promoted to full colonel by seniority on the 3rd of May 1796 and changed his name to Arthur Wellesley in 1798. India. In 1799 the regiment took part in the 4th Anglo-Mysore War in a division commanded by Colonel Arthur Wellesley, as part of a British East India Company army, commanded by Major General Harris, with Major General Sir David Baird as second in command. Arthur's eldest brother Richard Wellesley, 2nd Earl of Mornington, later 1st Marquess Wellesley, had just become Governor-General of India. So, in addition to the 33rd, Arthur, who had now become Colonel Arthur Wellesley, was given command of the 10,000 men of the Nizam of Hyderabad. They had a decisive part to play in the Battle of Seringapatam. The regiment, involved in bitter fighting with the Tipu Sultan's warriors, were repulsed with heavy losses when they attacked a wood, which was strongly defended by the Sultan's forces. The 33rd rallied and fought further actions throughout the battle, with the British emerging decisively victorious and the Tipu Sultan being killed. The regiment won a battle honour for its involvement in the action. Napoleon's return and Waterloo. By early March 1815, the regiment was again under the command of the Duke of Wellington, this time during the 100 Days campaign of Napoleon, having taken part in the action of the previous day at the Battle of Quatre-Bras. They took part in the action at Waterloo. The 33rd was part of the 5th Brigade under the command of Major General Sir Colin Halkett. West Indies. Having departed from Paris on the 23rd of December 1815, the regiment spent the post-Waterloo period, from January 1816 to 1821, in uneventful garrison duties in Guernsey, Stirling, Glasgow, Ulster and Dublin. In 1822, the regiment was posted to Jamaica. The West Indies were notorious as the deathbed of the British Army because of the high mortality rate from malaria, dysentery, yellow fever and other such endemic diseases. Crimea. Owing to its links with Wellington, the title 33rd Regiment was granted to the 33rd on the 18th of June 1853 by Queen Victoria, in honour of the 1st Duke of Wellington, who had died on the 14th of September the previous year. At the Battle of Alma, bitter fighting took place, with the 33rd being part of the Light Division under the command of Sir George Brown. The British advanced up the slope towards the Russian positions. The British formations became intermingled, turning into a mass of soldiers, rather than the professional, neat formations used on parade. As they charged, numerous Russian troops came down the slope to meet them. The British halted and fired, causing so many casualties the Russians were forced to retreat. The British line reorganized and moved up the slope towards the Great Redoubt, with the 33rd being the first to attack the defense works. The 33rd suffered heavy casualties, 7 officers and 232 men in the hand-to-hand combat that ensued. At the Battle of Inkerman, the 33rd were again involved in some bitter fighting, in which the British infantry advanced despite heavy losses and a strong defense by the Russians. The fighting was fierce, at times some soldiers resorting to attacking their enemy with the butts of the guns. The 33rd suffered further casualties, 3 officers and 61 men. The 33rd was involved in the siege of Sevastopol, which lasted for 11 months. By 1856, the war was over but for little gain. Abyssinia. The 33rd were part of an expedition sent to the East African nation of Abyssinia, now known as Ethiopia, after several European citizens had been taken hostage by the self-appointed King Emperor Tewodros II in 1864. In March 1866, a British envoy had been dispatched to secure the release of a group of missionaries who had first been seized after the British government refused Tewodros's requests for military assistance. The 33rd was committed to Abyssinia in October 1867 and embarked on the 21st of November, arriving at Annesley Bay on the 4th of December, but did not disembark for 3 days due to the chaos on shore. Lord Napier arrived in early January 1868 and the expedition started from the advance camp at Sanafa at the beginning of February. It took 2 months to reach their objective, advancing through rough terrain. In his dispatch to London, Lord Napier reported, "Yesterday morning descended 3,900 feet to Bashila River and approached Magdala with 1st Brigade to reconnoitre it. Theodore opened fire with 7 guns from outwork 1,000 feet above us, and 3,500 men of the garrison made a gallant sortie which was repulsed with very heavy loss and the enemy driven into Magdala. British lost 20 wounded." As the British force moved on to Magdala, Tewodros II sent 2 of the hostages on parole to offer terms. Napier insisted on the release of all the hostages and an unconditional surrender. Tewodros refused to cede to the unconditional surrender, but did release the European hostages. The British continued the advance and assaulted the fortress. On reaching the gate there was a pause in the advance, as it was discovered the engineer unit had forgot the powder kegs and scaling ladders and were ordered to return for them. General Staveley was not happy at any further delay and ordered the 33rd to continue the attack. Several officers and the men of the 33rd Regiment, along with an officer from the Royal Engineers, parted from the main force and, after climbing the cliff face, found the way blocked by a thorny hedge over a wall. Private James Bergen, a very tall man, used his bayonet to cut a hole in the hedge, and drummer Michael Magner climbed onto his shoulders through the hedge in the gap and dragged Bergen up behind him as Ensign Connor and Corporal Murphy helped shove from below. Bergen kept up a rapid rate of fire on the Coquette Burr as Magner dragged more men through the gap in the hedge. As more men poured through and opened fire as they advanced with the bayonets, the defenders withdrew through the second gate. The party rushed the Coquette Burr before it was fully closed and then took the second gate, breaking through to the amber. Ensign Winter scrambled up onto the top of the second gate and fixed the 33rd Regiment's colours to show the plateau had been taken. Private Bergen and drummer Magner were later awarded the Victoria Cross for their part in the action. Tewodros II was found dead inside the second gate, having shot himself with a pistol that had been a gift from Queen Victoria. When his death was announced, all opposition ceased. The regiment later received the Battle Honour Abyssinia. The Volunteers. The invasion scare of 1859 led to the creation of the Volunteer Force and huge enthusiasm for joining local Rifle Volunteer Corps. A large number of individual RVCs were raised in the West Riding, some amalgamated into larger units, and the rest of the smaller units were grouped into administrative battalions. For example, the RVCs raised in Halifax were amalgamated as the 4th Yorkshire RVC in 1860. The senior unit in the 5th Admin BN at Huddersfield was the 6th Yorkshire RVC, officially entitled the Huddersfield Rifles in 1868. In 1880 the 5th Admin BN was consolidated as a new 6th Yorkshire RVC. Similarly, the 2nd Admin BN at Skipton in Craven was consolidated as a new 9th Yorkshire RVC in 1880. In February 1883, as part of the Childers reforms, these three corps were designated as the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Volunteer Battalions of the Duke of Wellington's regiment. By 1887 they had adopted the same uniform as the parent unit. Under the mobilization scheme introduced by the Stanhope Memorandum of December 1888, the volunteer battalions of the Duke of Wellington's were assigned to the West Yorkshire Volunteer Infantry Brigade in Northern Command, and in the event of war were expected to mobilize at Leeds. Similarly, the Childers reforms brought the militia into the regimental system, and the 6th West York Militia became the 3rd Battalion of the Duke of Wellington's duties of empire. The regiment began the first year of the 20th century at war when it arrived in South Africa in 1900, as reinforcements for British forces fighting Boers in the Second Boer War. The battalion took part in the relief of Kimberley in February 1901, which had been under siege by the Boers since October 1899. The battalion also took part in the Battle of Paardeberg, which was eventually captured by the British after the Boers surrendered on the 27th of February 1901. The 3rd Battalion was embodied in January 1900 for service in South Africa, returning to the United Kingdom in late May 1902. All three volunteer battalions also sent service companies to support the regular battalions, and received the Battle Honour South Africa 1900 to 1902. Territorial Force. When the Territorial Force was formed under the Haldane reforms in 1908, the volunteer battalions were renumbered as battalions of the parent regiments. The Duke of Wellington's 1st VB became the 4th Battalion at Halifax. The 2nd VB formed two new battalions, the 5th Battalion at Huddersfield, and the 7th Battalion at Milnes Bridge. The 3rd VB became the 6th Battalion at Skipton. The former West Yorkshire Brigade was split in two, and the 40 F battalions of the Duke of Wellington's regiment composed the new 2nd West Riding Brigade in the West Riding Division. First World War Regular Army. The 1st Battalion remained in India throughout the war, serving first with the 2nd Division and then with the 1st Division. The 2nd Battalion landed at Le Havre as part of the 13th Brigade in the 5th Division in August 1914 for service on the Western Front. It first saw action at the Battle of Mons. It then fought a rearguard action at the Battle of Locato, and action during the retreat from Mons. The 2nd Battalion also fought at the First Battle of the Marne, the Battle of the Aisne, the Battle of Le Bassée, and the brutal First Battle of Ypres. The 2nd Battalion was also at the Battle of Hill 60, during which the British launched a massive bombardment, followed by an assault that led to vicious hand-to-hand fighting. The 8th Battalion saw service in the Gallipoli campaign, and the 10th Battalion was in action at Piave in Italy. Territorial Force. The 1, 4th, 1, 5th, 1, 6th and 1, 7th Battalions landed in France as part of the 147th Brigade in the 49th Division in April 1915 for service on the Western Front and served together until the armistice in November 1918. They saw action on the Somme, at Ypres, during the German Spring Offensive and the final Allied 100 Days Offensive. In August 1914 the Territorial Force formed second-line units, distinguished from the first line by the addition of 2 to the battalion number, the parent units taking 1 The 2, 4th, 2, 5th, 2, 6th and 2, 7th battalions of the Duke of Wellington's formed 186th Brigade in 62nd Division. The division's training was hampered by the lack of equipment and by the need to provide drafts to the first-line units serving overseas, but finally landed in France in January 1917 and served on the Western Front until the armistice. It fought at Arras, Cambrai, in the Spring Offensive and the 100 Days, and was the only TF division selected to form part of the Allied occupation force in the Rhineland after the war. The Territorial Force battalions also formed third-line units, which remained in the UK training and supplying drafts for the battalions overseas. New armies. The 8th Battalion landed at Suvla Bay in Gallipoli as part of the 32nd Brigade in the 11th Division in August 1915. The battalion was evacuated in January 1916 and moved to France in July 1916 for service on the Western Front. The 9th Battalion landed at Boulogne-sur-Mer as part of the 52nd Brigade in the 17th Division in July 1915, also for service on the Western Front, while the 10th Battalion landed at Le Havre as part of the 69th Brigade in the 23rd Division in August 1915, also for service on the Western Front. Interwar. In 1919, the 1st Battalion took part in the Third Anglo-Afghan War and eventually returned home in 1921. Meanwhile, the regiment's title altered slightly in 1921 to Duke of Wellington's Regiment. In the 1930s, the increasing need for anti-aircraft defense for Britain's cities was addressed by converting a number of TAR infantry battalions into searchlight battalions of the Royal Engineers. The 5th Duke of Wellington's was one unit selected for this role, becoming 43rd Anti-Aircraft Battalion, Royal Engineers in 1936, retaining its Duke of Wellington's cap badges. In 1938, the 4th Battalion at Halifax was converted into 58th Anti-Tank Regiment, Royal Artillery.